From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Mene Ukwe-Barua and Kyle Peterson. Kyle, I want to point out a paradox here in maybe a case of political malpractice on the part of Republicans in the polling data that the Wall Street Journal poll says 64% of Americans have a negative view of the U.S. economy, which is 2 to 1 almost in terms of thinking the economy is bad. And 49% think the U.S. is in recession. And yet Democrats are still favored 47 to 44% in the fight for Congress. You know, one argument would be that the reason you could have these odd results would be that the Republicans just haven't done a very good job of linking inflation and the poor economy to Democratic policies. Maybe it's because they pin it all on Biden, or maybe they've just not had that message get through. But boy, you would think that with those kinds of economic numbers, that Republicans would benefit.
Or perhaps there was a sense of complacency previously, that they thought that the underlying trends were so favorable that a wave would just sweep them into office. They would take the House, they would take the Senate. And so I think that's right. One argument that you can make as the party that is out of power in Washington is you need to send us to Washington to put a check on the other guys. And I think the Republicans have a real opportunity to make that kind of argument. We've seen the bills that President Biden has passed, the proposals that are floating around in Washington, including whatever else is left on President Biden's Build Back Better agenda that he hasn't been able to get through. Subsidies for childcare, intrusions of government into whole new areas of American life that it isn't right now. And I think Republicans ought to be making an argument that you need us as a check on the Biden administration. Otherwise, President Biden, for all his claims during the 2020 campaign that he would unite the country and govern from the center, he's going to keep putting through the Elizabeth Warren agenda, the Bernie Sanders agenda. I'm frankly a little bit puzzled that they haven't been making that argument more often. Part of the difficulty is it's a midterm election. There's no unifying figure at the top of the ticket. These races are being fought out state by state and district by district. But maybe there's a reason for somebody in leadership in Washington to do a sort of 1994 contract with America and try to get some sort of centralized messaging going. And perhaps the changing of the polls is what Republicans needed to prompt them to go that direction.
They are going to come out with some kind of policy proposals. They're talking about the House Republicans had working groups putting together agendas on various issues. We'll see what they come up with. But I want to push back on Mene here on the Donald Trump issue from the first part of the program. Mene says that the data is not overwhelming, that Trump has become a big factor. I agree. It's not as clear-cut as gas prices. I would argue that it's still a factor. And here's a couple of data points. One, from March, when the Wall Street Journal took its last survey, Trump's total approval has fallen from 48 to 44%, disapproval up to 55. Meanwhile, Joe Biden's total approval is bumped up to 45 from 42. And head-to-head, Trump was tied in March with Biden, 45-45 if you ran for president again. Now it's Biden clearly 50 to 44. And, of course, Trump has become back at the center of the political world because of the Mar-a-Lago search of his home by the Justice Department. It's become a dominant media issue. And, of course, Donald Trump also playing a big role in helping to nominate various candidates, particularly for the Senate, but also here and there, or block certain candidates who voted to impeach him, putting more Republican seats in jeopardy. So I think Trump's reassertion of himself helps to in this election campaign, and the Democratic reassertion of Trump through the Mar-a-Lago search has helped to make this more of a choice election. Who do you want? You want the Democrats, or do you want that guy Trump and his party, versus a referendum on Biden's policies, which had been animating Republican voters throughout the year?
I do agree with that. And I think it's easy to understand how the return of Trump to the center stage would sort of shift voters towards a slightly more favorable impression of Biden and the Democrats, especially in that when Trump is sort of removed from the picture, people, when they think of Donald Trump, remember sort of the period that he presided over, which was economically, for the most part, until COVID, a much better time. You had job growth and you had stable prices. And I think a lot of people saw that as the high point in recent history of U.S. economic outcomes. And Republicans were associated with that memory and were able to make the claim that if you elect us, then we'll get back on the path to the sort of pre-COVID, pre-inflation economy. But once Trump's back on the center stage, then the association becomes more with sort of the chaos that surrounded him. He has much more of an influence on Republican candidates. And as you said, he's been able to be a kingmaker in some of these primary elections. So it doesn't surprise me to see that Trump being more visible has tilted momentum towards the Democrats a little bit.
All right. We should underscore that August polls are not November destiny, and that after Labor Day, Republicans in recent history have tended to do better in the pre-election polling. Their generic polling numbers, D's versus R's, head-to-head for Congress, have tended to improve. So it's possible that the fundamentals of a normal midterm election, which favors the party out of power traditionally, could reassert themselves and probably will to some extent, unless you get some exogenous event. Who knows what would happen if you had a war that expanded in Europe or some other event. So we shouldn't look at this snapshot from August as determining what will happen. But it is interesting that the hopes that Republicans had for a wave election have really ebbed. I want to talk, Kyle, about the Alaska special election, which was won by a Democrat, Mary Peltola, over Sarah Palin, of course, the former vice presidential candidate and former governor of Alaska, and another Republican, Nick Begich. And there's a twist here, right? Republicans divided that vote, but this was a ranked choice voting process, and that probably helped Peltola. So tell us what happened.
Well, the thing to remember about ranked choice voting, and some people call it instant runoff voting, is the way it works is there's 3 candidates here on the Alaska ballot. People go in, they rank them in order of preference, and if nobody gets above 50%, then the bottom person is eliminated, and that person's votes are reshuffled to the second preference. And the issue with that is it makes it very important who's at the bottom, who is second or third, can influence the final outcome. And so what happened here is that you had Nick Begich, who was at the bottom of the list. He was eliminated. And first of all, 11,000 of his voters did not choose a second choice. So that's about 6% of the total votes, and those got set aside because they didn't choose a second preference candidate. But when the votes were then reshuffled, the winner who came out on top was the Democrat Mary Peltola. And I find myself wondering what would have happened if the second and third place candidates were flipped, if Sarah Palin had been on the bottom of the stack and she had been eliminated. Then perhaps more of her voters would have preferred the Republican Nick Begich. So part of what has gone on here seems like it has to do with the personality of Sarah Palin, sort of regular, moderate, centrist Republicans not wanting to vote for someone who has a history in the state, a history of being a political celebrity. But part of it is also this ranked choice system, which is a little bit confusing. And I think it also opens the way for some gamesmanship. It gives Democrats here the incentive to rank Sarah Palin as their first choice, because what they really want is a final head-to-head between their Democratic candidate and the Republican who is viewed as farthest to the right or the most extreme. It gives them an opportunity to sort of influence that. And so the thing I keep going back to is they call this instant runoff voting. What was the problem with old-fashioned runoff voting, where you really get a head-to-head between two candidates without all of this confusion of ranking and incentives to try to rank the other guy higher so that you can influence the final matchup?
That confusion, I think, for voters, voters are used to going in and, okay, here's your choice. You vote for that person. And then some states accept the plurality judgment of the voters. Others require a runoff, that somebody get over 50%. Okay, fair enough. But when you have ranked choice, there's a lot of gamesmanship, a lot of voters, particularly low information voters, but who are still they still have a right to vote. they may not follow politics as closely. It can be very confusing. And here we have the election that took place in mid-August, and we're only finding out 2 weeks later who actually is the winner. That's also a problem. And I wonder if there is this sort of thing with its complexity doesn't undermine actual confidence in elections. Monet, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think it certainly does that. I mean, people already, I think, are having less and less faith in sort of the integrity of elections from both sides of the aisle for different reasons. And creating these new sort of formats for voting is something that's going to only increase that. I think that you saw that in New York City when we had candidates for the Democratic mayoral primary elected by ranked choice ballot. There was quite a lot of backbiting among the candidates that took place after the votes were cast. The candidates who lost announced that they were challenging the result even before it was finalized. So I think there's just kind of an inherent suspicion in the idea that the several rounds of counting introduces an opportunity for confusion. But generally, I do think that Kyle's right to say that sort of there's a longstanding history of having a clear choice, that we have an expectation that the electorate should not have to, spend hours and hours familiarizing themselves with the policy platforms of a ceaseless list of candidates, and that people should be able to cast the vote for the individual who they think is best qualified to fill that office, and they will understand the connection between their vote and the result much more clearly in that sort of system.
And a choice based on policy differences rather than calculating, 2 or 3 steps down the road based on gamesmanship. But ranked choice is now here, and not just in Alaska, in several places. New York City is one of them. And we'll see how it continues to play out. Thank you, Monet. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you all for listening. We're back every day with Potomac Watch. Please email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. And we hope to have you back with us tomorrow. Thanks for listening.